Hello and welcome to another lecture for human sexuality. In this lecture we're going to talk about sexual assault. So much of this video coming up, or much of the lecture coming up, is one that I recorded at the actual beginning of the pandemic. It's a little bit over a year old. The material is still relevant. The only issue is going to be that the sound quality is poor. I have the full intention of re-recording all of the lectures with the better sound quality. But in an effort to get this lecture to you guys now, I'm just going to use the previous recording. I'm just re-recording the first two slides and the last slide and getting it to you now so that you have it. If I re-recorded it, it would be the same material. It would just be better sound quality. So if there's a sound quality issue, if you don't like it, if you don't want to listen to it, then send me an email and I'll once I get it re-recorded, which may not be for a little while, I will get it to you. So I'm just going to read this slide as it is, just because it's important to read to have it very clear. This is a difficult topic to talk about. It's even more difficult for those who have experienced what I'm about to talk about. It's important that we discuss it, though, as it is a part of human sexuality. While it is difficult to understand why scientists would do research on rape and sexual assault, it's important to understand that the more we know about it and why it happens, the more we can prevent it. Let's start, though, with sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is defined as any unwanted or unsolicited sexual attention from another individual in the workplace. It doesn't have to be just the workplace, but we typically or classically define it as the workplace. For most perpetrators, the motivation is to obtain short-term mating opportunities. Those individuals who are perpetrating sexual harassment, males or females, typically males, but males or females, are doing it in order to have sex or for the hopes of having sex. Most cases involve men harassing young, single, and attractive women, and that's something we'll come back to when we're talking about rape and sexual assault, how that translates over. The one issue here is that women do experience stress, they experience anxiety from it, but what has actually been found is women are somewhat less bothered by harassment from higher status men. And you might ask the question, why might this be? Why even bring this up? This goes back to those things we were talking about in the first few chapters with evolutionary theory and how that applies so much to sex and reproduction, and how those men that are higher status would be more prized. So as a result, it's not saying that women aren't bothered by. It's more saying that on average women are less bothered by those that are higher status, because if for some reason that woman does get in a relationship with that guy, that possibility of having a higher status mate becomes present. Not saying again that it's right, not going there, just saying that has been found in the studies. Just some things to talk about with resisting sexual harassment. So why do we have to talk about resisting? Well, first of all, obviously, the primary goal should be, even before we talk about resisting, is education. Educate on what is sexual harassment to reduce it. But if that doesn't work, then you look at, well, how can you resist or reduce sexual harassment if it is happening to you? First of all, familiarize yourself with your employer's policies on sexual harassment. The more you know about the company's policies, the more you can turn your situation into better for you, reducing that possibility of it occurring. Conveying a professional attitude. This is just along the lines of if the person that is harassing you is trying to get a rise out of you, trying to flirt with you, if you remain professional, it can, in some cases, just shut that down. This next one should be pretty obvious, but discouraging harassing behaviors and encouraging appropriate behaviors is very important. This just if the behavior is inappropriate, discourage it. Tell them it's inappropriate. Next is avoiding being alone with the harasser. If the individual has harassed you before, being alone with them, obviously this isn't always doable, but avoiding being alone, because if you're alone with them, they have another opportunity. By avoiding being alone, you're avoiding that opportunity. Maintaining a record is very important, especially if you're going to try to get the person fired or try to get the situation resolved outside of just directly communication with that person. That does come back to talking with the harasser. One thing that's been found in studies is that in I wouldn't say the majority of cases, but in a large number of cases, the harasser doesn't even realize what they are doing is being viewed as harassing. So by talking with them, by telling them you are uncomfortable, by telling them that you are not interested, that you're finding it as harassment, that can change the behavior immediately in many cases. Writing a letter to the harasser if you feel uncomfortable talking with them directly, writing a letter to them, especially if you write it in email, so you've got that maintained record. Seeking support is very important. If you feel uncomfortable, you should always seek support. Don't try to do it alone, because then you can go back to that avoiding being alone with the harasser. It's kind of the same thing. If you've got support, you don't have to go through these types of things alone. And then filing a complaint, this is pretty obvious. If you feel uncomfortable, if you feel harassed, you should file a complaint, because it is likely that that person has done this before. They may do it again. By filing a complaint, you get that on the record and possibly get the situation resolved through that means. And if none of that works, seeking legal remedies is an option, and again, if none of the other things are working, it is definitely recommended. So now we are going to transition into sexual assault. First, we have to define what is sexual assault. So sexual assault, this for most should be pretty self-explanatory, is any form of sexual contact without voluntary consent. Some people view sexual assault as only when penetration occurs, but sexual assault, as we are defining it, is any sexual contact without voluntary consent. And so it can range anywhere from unwanted touching to sexual violence. It can range anywhere from just no injury, no physical injury anyway, all the way to serious physical injury, even possibly death. It is often referred to as rape. We are going to refer to it mostly as sexual assault, but a few times I will use the term rape. And there are levels assigned to it when we're talking from a research context. In the US, we don't use these levels, but in Canada, they do use these levels. So when I'm reporting statistics about these different levels, it is from Canada, because in Canada, they do use these levels, and the levels are based on the seriousness of the assault. Looking at these, first is level 1 sexual assault. In this, it involves no physical injury or minor physical injury. Maximum sentence for this is 10 years. So this is typically when if penetration does occur, it's not a forceful penetration that causes harm. Level 2 sexual assault is when a weapon is used, or there's threats to a third party or threats of causing bodily harm. Again, much like level 1, there might be no injury. There might be, even with penetration, there might be no injury, but there's threats involved. And this is maximum sentence of 14 years. Level 3 is classified as aggravated sexual assault. This is when wounding, maiming, disfigurement, or truly endangering the victim's life comes into play. So this is when harm does occur, or if harm doesn't occur, it's when the victim's life might be in danger as part of the assault. And this does carry a maximum life sentence. We will say in these, the majority of sexual assaults are going to be level 1. Then the next most common is level 2, and the least common is actually level 3. But we'll come back to that and talk about that later. Looking at incidence rates in general, there is actually, again, these statistics are going to be in Canada, about 1 sexual assault that occurs every 15 minutes. That is very often, very common, and this is just what's reported, so it's probably, not probably, it is much, much higher than this. We'll come back to that in just a second. And as I said, the majority of cases are going to be level 1, so 97%, almost all cases do not involve harm or a very minimal amount of harm. And when I say harm, I'm talking physical harm. Obviously, majority of these are causing psychological harm, but the law looks at these in different ways. One thing, and again, this is Canadian, a national random telephone sample actually reported twice as many sexual assaults, just many were being unreported. And research that's looked at this even more in depth says it's probably much less than this that are even, or much more assaults are actually occurring than this that are not being reported. So even in these surveys like this, people are unwilling to report when it does occur. Let's move on to the different types of sexual assault, and what I mean here is more of just broad categories. First is going to be stranger sexual assault. We're going to talk about these all on their individual slides, so I'm not going to talk about them on this slide. So you've got stranger sexual assault, acquaintance sexual assault, multiple perpetrators, so this is where we classify gang rapes, sexual assault of men, spousal sexual assault, and finally sexual assault by women, to be separate from sexual assault of men. All right, let's look at that first one. That's stranger sexual assault. This is a sexual assault that's committed by someone previously unknown. This is where you see in media and a lot of the fears are about this occurring. But before I even go on, this is actually relatively rare in comparison to the other types of sexual assault. It does occur, obviously, but it's relatively rare. Often the victims are individuals who are vulnerable, people who live alone, maybe are alone on a deserted street. They may be asleep, they may be intoxicated, they may have been drugged, that type of thing. Individuals who perpetrate this often try to find a safe place and time to commit the assault. What that means is they look for times where there isn't others around, where they can get away with it. The ages of those that are victims are between 18 and 44, are most likely to be attacked. Those over 44 are less likely. And actually, when you look at the numbers, which we'll look at later in the slides, the younger is much more common. So 18 to 24 is about the most common age range. Most assaults actually do take place in public places, though, even if the person the perpetrator is trying to get the person alone. It might be in a restroom or in a closet or in an alley, but they tend to be done in public places, which is kind of scary when you think about it. Next we'll look at is actually the most common type of sexual assault, and that's acquaintance sexual assault. So in this case, it's where victims are likely to be or are assaulted by someone they know. And as I said, this is the most common type of sexual assault, is when someone, things like date rape or somebody else you know that commits the assault. It could be a classmate, a coworker, it could be a family friend, all of these types of things, someone you're on a date with, and it could be done through just drugging, through force, through even some of those other types that we talked about, like breaking in, things like that, but it's done by someone you know. And I wouldn't even say quite often, in some cases, the individual who perpetrates the sexual assault doesn't even view it as or perceive it as sexual assault. what they're doing they believe to be consensual, or they believe to, if it's not in the actual full sexual penetration act, they don't view it as something that is along those lines of flagrant enough to be sexual assault, so they don't perceive it to be sexual assault themselves, even if the victim does. So along those lines, it is definitely still sexual assault, but it's not perceived by the perpetrator in all cases to actually be sexual assault. As I've said a few times already, it can happen in dating situation. This is when things like date rape occur, when the couple is maybe in a situation where they are progressing and the girl says to stop and the guy doesn't stop. So this most often involves intercourse when you're talking about date rape. And it is more likely to occur when a couple have had too much to drink or are intoxicated for some other reason. So any types of drugs, alcohol, increase the chances of this happening. This happens mainly due to lowered inhibitions. People are more likely to miss cues or to have poor judgment when they are intoxicated. Next is multiple perpetrators, gang rapes, as I said. So this is when groups rape someone. This is actually relatively rare. It is possibly even rarer than stranger sexual assault. And you're going to see for the first time here this prevailing opinion. So prevailing opinion, I'm going to give this a few times for a few different things, is the prevailing opinion in the amongst the media, amongst the legislatures, amongst some social scientists, and that is the prevailing opinion here is that exercise of power is a major motive for gang rapes, for multiple perpetrator sexual assaults. In the prevailing opinion, if it's not exercise of power, that it may be expressing anger against women. We'll come back to that. We're not going to talk about that more now, but we are going to come back to that. Next is sexual assault of men. Prevalence here is unknown. Why is the prevalence unknown? Well, the prevalence is mainly unknown because most men are unwilling to admit that they've been assaulted when it does occur. It's viewed in society as being weak, or that guys should want to be assaulted by women. And because of that, guys who do feel that an assault has occurred, that it was something unwanted, they are much less likely to report it. So it could be a high number of occurrences, but we don't know because so few report it. It's estimated that about 1 in 10 victims of sexual assault are men, so it's still a relatively low number. About 90% of sexual assaults are perpetrated on women, but that's still a higher number than 0. That obviously sexual assault against both men and women should be 0, but if it's higher than 0, it is something that should be looked into and researched. This is the one where it is actually more likely to be committed by strangers, usually heterosexual men who are perpetrating. It doesn't make sense there, but there's other underlying factors, and there's quite a bit of research that is currently ongoing looking at the reasoning for this. Here, the motives can include sexual gratification, revenge and retaliation, gang status and affiliation, things like that. These various different reasons for it occurring, even in some cases with sexual assault against women, do work against men as well. Next thing we'll talk about is spousal sexual assault. So about 8% of women report being sexually assaulted by their partner. This one most often goes unreported of all of the ones here. And again, this prevailing opinion is that motives vary, but can include sex to dominate the partner, degrade the partner, the solution to all marital disputes, the context of marital violence, all of these types of things. kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about later. Pretty much what's being said here has not been supported by one bit of evidence that's out there. But we'll come back to this because this is the prevailing opinion, and it is what many, again, politicians, society, people who write books view as the motives for a lot of these sexual assaults is this. So it's something to come back to. One thing that's the case, though, is survivors of spousal sexual assault are often fearful of serious injury or death for reporting, because those guys that are willing to commit sexual assault on their partner are usually, or not usually, but quite often, those who are often willing to commit physical violence against their partners as well. Next one we'll talk about is sexual assault by women. This one is rare, not unheard of, but it is rare, and this one does need to be slightly differentiated from sexual assault on men. When we were talking about sexual assault on men a minute ago, we were looking at both by women and men. Now we're looking at just sexual assault by women. And this can be committed against other women, it can be committed against men, but as is said here, it is rare for it to occur. Though when it does occur, it actually often involves aiding men who are actually attacking other women. So they might be during gang attacks, might be used to lure women into a safe place for a sexual assault, holding other women down to be assaulted, that type of thing. And finally, it can also occur against men too, so that is something to consider. And that is one of those that does occur, and like I said, that is one of the cases where men tend to not report this when it does occur. And along the lines of women assist in the sexual assault of other women, they may also assist in the sexual assault of men as well. Next, let's talk about the social attitudes and very clear myths when it comes to sexual assault. So first is, when women say no, they mean yes. This one is very obviously not true. It is, when a woman says no, it has to be taken as no. There may possibly be instances where it is a playful situation, but it's better safe than sorry, because the majority of the time when women say no, they mean no. They don't mean yes. So this is a big myth that's definitely going away now, but in the past was perpetrated quite often, that women would say no when they mean yes. Next is, all women like a man who is pushy and forceful. Again here, some women have fetishes for this. Some, we're talking a small minority of women who do want this, but the vast majority do not enjoy a guy who is pushy, who is forceful, who is dominating, that type of thing. The next one is the way women dress. They're just asking to be raped. Do I even need to talk about this one? That's just completely absurd. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Next one, women want to be forced to have sex. This is actually an interesting one to talk about, because before we get into looking at this as a myth, one thing we do know from research is that many women, actually the majority of women, it's around 60% of women, actually have rape fantasies. They have fantasies about being raped. That being said, almost all of those that have these rape fantasies don't actually want to be raped. It's just a fantasy that brings arousal, but it's not a fantasy that they want to fulfillment. So saying that women want to be forced to have sex is complete BS. It is not true. And even women who have rape fantasies do not want to be forced to have sex. Next, let's look at the psychological characteristics of sex offenders. First and foremost, there is no single type of sex offender. It can be just about anyone. It's a broad range, there's lots of different characteristics, but that being said, there are a few things that do tend to overlap. Like the majority of sex offenders are actually in control of their behavior. They know it's illegal. So saying that sexual offenders are those who maybe have a mental issue and they don't know that what they're doing is illegal, or they're not in control of their behavior, that is not true. Most offenders are in control of their behavior and they do know what they are doing is not legal. The average age of sex offenders is about 32, and again, can spread a wide range, but the average age tends to be a bit younger in age. Those who commit sexual assault tend to have less than a grade 12 education. Again, wide range, but we're looking at on average, they have a less than high school education. Those who commit sexual assault often report feeling socially inadequate, and along those lines, they feel socially isolated, or they feel that they don't have the ability to get sex any other way. So, looking at that a little bit more, sex offenders are more likely than other men to condone sexual assault and violence against women. So those who are more along these lines misogynistic, those who believe sexual assault and violence against women in general is okay, they are more likely to commit it themselves. Those who hold more traditional gender roles, so these gender roles of women belong in the kitchen and men belong working and men are the head of the household, that type of thing, those who hold these traditional gender roles are more likely to commit sexual assault. One thing that's known here is that those who commit sexual assault are usually sexually experienced. So they have had sex before, and as a result, they are more likely to then be more willing to commit sexual assault. They tend to be more hostile towards women. This goes back to that first one, and even the second one, that traditional gender roles and condoning violence against women leads to more hostility. And one of the things here is those who commit sexual assault are more likely to be sexually aroused by depictions of sexual assault. So they are more likely themselves to enjoy watching others commit sexual assault. And this last one here, it's a bit hard to quantify, but they tend to be more irresponsible. Along those lines, tend to have more risk-taking, more of a lack of social conscience. And this just goes back to some of those earlier things. If you view violence as okay, if you view hostility as okay, if you view sexual assault as okay, then in general you're going to have a harder time with a social conscience and viewing other things as right and wrong. And again, that doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing is illegal. They just have more of a tendency to not view it as big of a wrong as it actually is. The final one is maybe have peer groups like fraternities or a gang or friend groups, things like that, that may pressure them into sexual activity. This is quite common on college campuses, especially with fraternities, where males have a lot of talk about having sex, and because of that, it might push people to these adolescent into young adult males into doing things that they know they shouldn't, because they have this desire to fit in. Okay, as I said a few times now, there's this prevailing opinion on the motives for sexual assault. Why do people commit sexual assault? There's three basic motives in the prevailing opinion. First is people commit sexual assault because of anger. It's that this sexual assault and rape is triggered by anger and resentment that men have towards women. The second is power. This desire to control and dominate women is a primary motive. So it's a desire of men to have power over women. And finally, sadistic. So this is ritualized and savage attacks. So the three basic motives for assault: anger towards women that men have, power over women that men want, or sadistic, ritualized, savage attacks that men commit towards women. I'm going to say right now, but we'll come back to this, that the only one of these that has any evidence is the last one, and this is more not the, or I should say not more, but this is not the case in acquaintance sexual assault or the majority of sexual assaults. This is the case in some of those instances of stranger sexual assault when an individual has this desire to cause harm, and they're causing harm through sexual assault. But the vast majority of sexual assaults do not apply to this sadistic sexual assault, and frankly, they don't apply to the first two either. Let's look at that a little bit more, though. So first, there's this philosophy of rape as an instrument of the patriarchy. So here's a quote that is, "Rape is an abuse of power and control in which the rapist seeks to humiliate, shame, embarrass, degrade, and terrify the victim. The primary objective is to exercise power and control over another person. This was said on the floor of the United Nations in 1993. And it is actually a quote from the book that you see here, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape by Susan Brownmiller. So with this, it's really, and I'll come back to Susan Brownmiller in just a second, but this book has basically been the basis for a lot of our views we have on rape and sexual assault. So first, we'll look at this. Despite the obvious practical importance of reducing rape, there has been relatively little research on the topic. I already talked about this at the beginning, but it really comes down to rape is an emotionally charged topic, and people can't get past the naturalistic fallacy. That is, that if something is natural, if something happens in nature, then it's morally okay. We talked about the naturalistic fallacy before and how the naturalistic fallacy is it gets to a lot of things and has a lot of issues when we're talking about things relating to evolution. Because if something is natural, if something is in nature, it is not necessarily morally right. If rape is a natural adaptation or a byproduct of another adaptation, meaning it is something that is biologically ingrained, if that is the case, that still doesn't make it morally correct or morally okay. It is still morally abhorrent. And along those lines, you've got the issue that I was talking about. A lot of people don't do research on it because they get accused of being pro-rape if they're doing research on it. In addition, the neglect of rape is a lot because of there was a group of feminist scholars in the 70s that proclaimed they already knew all the answers to rape, so we didn't need to do any research on it. And some of them weren't even necessarily scholars. They weren't social scientists. They were just people who had an interest in it. Susan Brownmiller is a good example. She wasn't even a scientist. She was just someone who had an interest in the topic, so she wrote a book about it. And so, according to Brownmiller in this 1975 book, rape is a crime of violence, not sex, and it's committed by all men against all women to keep women in their place. Before I go any farther, just ask yourself why we should be skeptical of this claim. And we'll look at that in the next few slides and look at why we should be skeptical, but it is key that we should be skeptical. And a lot of that is because of what we know now about evolution and evolutionary theory and evolutionary pressures. But let's get to that. So first, let's look at one of the challenges. So Brownmiller's hypothesis predicts that rapists should actually target older, more powerful women, especially politically powerful women. So her hypothesis is, or what she states is that it's about power, it's about dominance. So if that's the case, then men should want to commit rape against those who have power, who have dominance, to basically put them in their place. The problem is women over 40 are rarely raped. So the women over 40, they're the ones that usually have more power, more dominance. They're rarely raped. And this isn't because women that are over 40 aren't targeted by violent crime. If you look here, the red is murder victims, the green is the female population. You see that it does go down as women get older for murder victims, but not as much as rape victims does, in a sense that the percentage of rape victims is almost nil after 50 years old. In addition to that, women who are more powerful, who have more wealth, those type of women are actually the ones that are not typically the ones that are raped. It's actually the poor that are more likely to be raped. So if it's about putting people in their place, putting women in their place and power over them, then getting power over those that already don't have power, getting control over those that already don't have control, it doesn't hold up. And this is one of those things that I kind of talked about earlier, but this is, it's hard to talk about, but it's one of those things that needs to be looked at. That many rapes, the majority of rapes that occur actually involve very little physical violence. Many victims even report that the rapists are concerned about their well-being afterwards. And yes, rape without physical violence is still morally abhorrent. It's still damaging to women. It still causes psychological harm. But along those lines, why would this be the case? Why would men be interested in the welfare of the woman they have raped after? Well, if it's about dominance and power, they shouldn't be. But if it's actually about reproduction, then they should be concerned, because if it's about reproduction, then that woman is now potentially carrying their fetus, and their welfare is important. Here's another thought experiment to have, and this is one that's more telling of just how wrong Brown-Miller's theory is. So imagine you've got a young heterosexual couple that are about to have sex. Just prior to the act of sex, she changes her mind and says no. He persists and commits date rape. Rape occurs in this instance, so rape does occur. Prior to her saying no, his motivation was presumably sexual. Prior to her saying no, his motivation was sexual reproduction, or to have sex. Does it make sense to think that her saying no immediately triggers a shift in him from his motivation to have sex to now his motivation to oppress all women for the benefit of all men, or to dominate her, or to control her? No, that is definitely not the case. I'm not going to say it never happens, but in the vast majority of cases, his motivation is still about sex. So, contrary to the United Nations, Brown-Miller, many politically correct social scientists, any of those who view sexual assault as about power and dominance, for men, not necessarily for women, but for men, rape may actually primarily be about sex and sexual reproduction. So let's now actually look at some of the research that has been done into the actual motivations for rape. First, let's go back and define rape again and look at it now within this context of possible evolutionary explanations. So rape is defined as the use of force or threat of force to obtain sexual intercourse, because now we are talking about the actual act of reproduction. Rape or its threat is actually known in every human culture that's ever been studied. And along those lines, so it's present in all cultures, it's also ostracized or rapists are punished in all cultures. So it is something that is a human universal. It happens in all cultures. But in all cultures that are there, it is also something that is punished when it does occur. Hence why it happens as infrequently as it does, even if we do come up with evolutionary explanations for it. And then along those lines, the obvious evolutionary hypothesis is that rape is a strategy that some men use to obtain reproductive benefits, especially in cases where without the act of rape they wouldn't get those reproductive benefits. And when we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, and we look at how the evolutionary pressure of reproduction is so strong, as I said when we talked about it, that it's more important than survival. Well, if rape is an act of reproduction, then it is something that is going to have selection pressures for it. But along those lines, you're going to have counter adaptations as well, because it is of a benefit to the male in this case to do it, but it is harmful to the female in evolutionary terms, as well as actually practical and moral concerns, but it's harmful in evolutionary terms, so women should evolve counter adaptations, as well as men have the drawback of cuckoldry when it does occur, so even men have counter adaptations. Hence why when we go back, this in all cultures, rapists are punished or ostracized, because even if there is adaptations for it, there are many counter adaptations and cultural counter adaptations to it occurring. So we ask ourselves, is this evolutionary hypothesis possible? Let's look at that through the next few slides. First, can rape evolve as an adaptation? Well, if we look at comparative psychology, so if we look at other non-human animals and look at those species and see if it is present there, then it becomes more understandable in humans. So in scorpion flies, the males possess a clamp that functions to restrain females during any forced copulations. So it occurs in scorpion flies. In orangutans, lower status, smaller males will frequently force copulate on females, especially when the dominant alpha males are not around. And from this, they gain paternity from these forced matings. Male ducks engage in forced copulations. I could go on and on and on. That we've found it in many, many species where forced copulation does occur. Along those lines, then, why might rape occur as, instead of direct adaptation for it, maybe as a byproduct of other adaptations? So one of the things is desire for sexual variety. We talked about this. Men have a greater desire for sexual variety because having more sexual variety is of an evolutionary advantage. Having children from multiple different women is an advantage. Along those lines, you have that adaptation, this desire for variety, can actually lead to instances of rape, because it becomes a byproduct of this desire to have intercourse with a variety of people. Next is greater sex drive. So we talked about this. Men have a greater sex drive than women. This greater sex drive is evolutionarily adaptive because you don't want to miss mating opportunities as a male, and this greater sex drive could lead to greater desire to or greater instances of rape. Willingness to engage in impersonal sex. It's another thing we talked about that can be an advantage for men, especially in short-term mating situations. Less discriminating criteria for short-term partners. Again, adaptation in short-term mating. Men have greater physical size and strength. Because of that, it even opens up the opportunity for rape to occur. And finally, aggressiveness evolved in non-rape contexts can then translate into rape contexts. So there are a long list here, and this isn't even exhaustive, but there are a long list of adaptations that men have that may become byproducts, or increased rape might become a byproduct of these adaptations. Back to this slide when we show when people are raped. Along those lines, for something to be evolutionarily selected for, it has to lead to increased reproduction or survival. And what we do know from studies is that some women that are raped actually get pregnant, even in modern societies with access to birth control. And even in modern societies, it's about 5% of women that are raped become pregnant. So it's definitely the case where it can lead to increased reproductive success. And in a historical context, when birth control wasn't present, it could have been as much as high as 30, 40, 50% of rapes that could have resulted in reproduction. And that is because those who commit rape, those perpetrators, have a preference for fertile victims. Not those that are the highest in reproductive value, not those that are the highest in status, the highest in dominance, those that are fertile. So women who are younger, especially those who are in that peak fertility 18 to 24 range, and as well they tend to target those who may be ovulating. We talked about concealed ovulation. One of those things along the lines of concealed ovulation is we talked about how men can still detect it, and men actually tend to try to target those who are ovulating without even being aware of it. There is also preferential targeting for women who have no defense or recourse. So those who are poor, those who are in war zones, those who can't retaliate against the guy. And when marital rape does occur, it tends to actually be more context specific to when sperm competition might exist, meaning it is much more likely to occur when a guy suspects that his partner is cheating on him or has cheated on him recently, and that goes back to that sperm competition we talked about earlier. One of the things that's been proposed is rape as a pathology. Rape as a pathology, meaning that only those who are mentally have a mental disability or have a mental disorder are likely to commit rape, but this actually seems unlikely because of what we know from research. First, some rapes do result in pregnancy, so there are selective pressures evolutionarily for men to commit rape. A fairly high proportion of men, as much as 30% in one study, admit they might rape if there were no possible punishments. That's very scary to think about, but as much as 30% admitted. So the number may even be higher than that didn't admit to it, but would be willing to if there were no possible punishments. That's a scary number. And along those lines, that's just survey what we actually know from instances where it does occur. A high proportion of men do actually commit rape when punishment is highly unlikely, like in war. So during war times, women get raped at a much higher frequency, and it goes back to this, that there is no or a reduced repercussions for those committing this. And we look at historically in the past and how wars have resulted in the spread of genes due to rape that occurs. One of the instances is Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan and his two sons basically conquered much of the known world at the time. And one of the things that was very common for them, their army to do, specifically Genghis Khan and his sons themselves, it was to rape those in places that he conquered. It is estimated that somewhere between 1% and 5% of all people in Asia now are descended from Genghis Khan because of how many children he had. Modern conditions also foster an increased likelihood of rape. So historically, if people were in a village together and a guy committed an act of rape, and he became ostracized or punished, then he would be likely to die, either from the punishment or from the ostracization, because now he doesn't have the group to work with. So in a historical context, that was a very big buffer against rape. However, in modern conditions, we have a big lack of extended kin and close proximity. Historically, we would have been closer to our relatives. Our relatives could have acted as a buffer. Anonymity. We are in an environment where it's very easy to escape consequences by disappearing. You can show up in one place one day and be in another place the next day, and no one ever know who you were in that one place. So we have a much bigger anonymity in modern environments. And along with those lines, we have much more mobility. So that mobility allows for anonymity and lack of extended kin, and it allows for people to become in situations where they become more vulnerable, or for men to be in situations where they can perpetrate and get away with it. And just along those lines, the sheer number of opportunities. There are many more victims available because of being in such a much larger society. So there are more opportunities, there are more victims, there are less people who have the kin around protecting them. There is more anonymity, there's more mobility. So it's just, in our modern environment, rape actually likely occurs much more often than it did historically, at least in the context of things like stranger rape. So as I already talked about, if there are benefits, or at least evolutionarily, to rape occurring, and that's why it has been selected for throughout our evolutionary history, there is a resulting cost to women as a result of this. And because these costs are present, there should be anti-rape adaptations in females. Some of these costs for females include damage and physical attacks, even if, as I said, it doesn't typically. In most cases there isn't, but there can still be untimely pregnancy. So a pregnancy with a non-preferred male, a pregnancy at a time where maybe the woman would be better spent doing something else. Obviously, any pregnancy from rape is likely to be negative, but along those lines, this is something that it's a cost. Possible abandonment by current mate. So one thing that happens historically and even in modern times is when a woman gets raped, her current partner has an increased likelihood of abandoning her. And that is, it's sad to think about, but it is something that does happen. Women that have been known to be raped have a weaker position to acquire future mates because it's this view of possible cuckoldry, that type of thing. And then finally there's damage to reputation, and this kind of ties back into all of these. Then if these are the costs, what are some of the adaptations that women would have to avoid it? And in actuality, there are a lot. There are way more than I can talk about here, but here are a few. First, women seek alliances. They seek alliances with those who can help protect them, family alliances. They stay close to kin. They seek out alliances with powerful men that can protect them, that can be a deterrent. One of the things that is looked at, has been researched, is how the psychological pain that comes from being raped actually motivates women to avoid future rapes. It's kind of a harsh thing to think about, but it is one of those things that translates into an environmental factor, can actually lead to a reduction in something like rape. Another anti-rape adaptation is that women have fear of the danger of rape. So because of this, they avoid situations where they might be susceptible to rape. They avoid being alone, things like that. And those who are more susceptible to being raped. Those are more in the age groups, the demographics. So like younger women, they tend to experience more fear and as a result tend to be more careful. And this goes back to avoidance of risky activities, but especially during ovulation. Again, we talked about ovulation, how it's concealed. Women don't typically even know they're ovulating themselves. But one thing that has been found is because while women are ovulating, there's this increased risk of getting pregnant. Women that are ovulating are underrepresented as rape victims. As I said before, men tend to try to target women who are ovulating, but women who are ovulating are actually unrepresented as victims because women who are ovulating tend to take less risks. So in one study, they showed that ovulating women are less likely to walk alone at night. And this isn't just due to things like lack of energy or hormones, because actually women who are ovulating have greater sexual desire, have greater energy, and greater activity. So even though women aren't aware that they're ovulating, while they are ovulating, they tend to be more cautious and avoid situations that could lead to rape. So here you see that when the other ones are phases. If you look at the gray bars, the one the arrow's not pointing to, that's women that are on the pill. You see really no difference throughout the ovulatory cycle. But the risk-taking score for those that are ovulating was much lower than those who are not ovulating. And again, I'm not going to say, and it's definitely not the case, that women are at fault for rape. What I'm saying here by avoiding situations is just more of a preventative type thing. Obviously, and we'll get to this in a bit, obviously the best way to prevent rape is to educate men on not raping. But there's still things that women can do to minimize their chances or reduce their chances. So, possible anti-rape adaptations. We have things like mate choice for a bodyguard, avoidance of risky situations, coalitions with females, males that are special friends, males that are friends in order to protect them, possible defenses during attempted rapes, to attack, to run, to scream for help, to fake cooperation. And this is an interesting one because this one goes along the lines of, and the next one, lubrication to prevent damage. Both of those go along the lines of the rape still may occur, but it minimizes the harm to the individual. And again, like I said before we had the break in class, is just because there's this lubrication occurring doesn't mean that women are okay with it and approving it and saying yes and agreeing. No, that's definitely not the case. It's an adaptation in order to prevent damage. There's also some defenses in the aftermath, retaliation and revenge against the rapist, the psychological pain preventing future occurrences that we talked about, and one of the adaptations women do, and this is why women tend to underreport, is because there is this predisposition or this natural tendency to conceal that it occurred, because if it gets out that it occurred, it can cause that potential loss of mate that I was talking about, or reputational damage. I hope we've come far enough as society that those who are victims of rape are becoming less susceptible to reputational damage. In many circles, they don't have reputational damage, and hopefully in the future we come to a point where there's no reputational damage to those who are victims of rape. But that mate loss one, that I hope we are getting to a point as a society where people don't leave their partners just because their partner got raped. So what are some real world implications here to consider? First, that an understanding of evolutionary theory, would it have led to a difference in a Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court claim that said that rape is without a doubt deserving of serious punishment, but in terms of moral depravity and of the injury to the person and the public, it does not compare to murder. Rape does not include even serious injury to another person. And this is, again, where it goes back to understanding evolutionary theory, understanding why it's occurring, would revise this to understand that it does cause harm. It does cause serious injury, even if the injury is not physical, it's psychological. It does cause harm to the reputation of the individual, to their reproductive success, to things like that. So rape is very morally abhorrent, and we should know more about it so that we can help prevent it. Another thing is sexual harassment and stalking laws typically involve what is called a reasonable person standard. And this reasonable person standard is a bunch of BS, because what the reasonable person standard says is that would a person, or it holds a person liable for behavior if a reasonable person would have found that behavior to be sexual harassing or fear-inducing. But from what we know from evolutionary research is that women and men have a different judge of what is sexually harassing, of what is fear-inducing. So by asking a group to say, is this a reasonable so if you go by this reasonable person standard and ask a group, is this sexual harassment or is this fear-inducing? The problem with this is if you've got a majority of guys there, it's probably less likely to be considered harassing or fear-inducing. If you've got a majority of women, it's more likely. So we should get away from this reasonable person standard and just have some strict definitions of it. So if reasonable women and reasonable men have different reactions, how exactly can a jury apply an ungendered reasonable person standard? No firm solutions have been obtained, but legal scholars are beginning to evaluate evolutionary-based findings, such as the ones we've been talking about, for constructing laws that are more effective for their intended purpose, such as the reduction of sexual harassment, stalking, and rape. Last thing I want to talk about here before I move on to one more thing, but the last thing relating to sexual assault, what to do if you're sexually assaulted and things to do to reduce sexual assault. First of all, if you are sexually assaulted, don't change anything about your body. Don't wash or even comb your hair. You could be washing out evidence. Strongly consider reporting the incident to the police. As I already said, many women have a tendency to not report, this inclination to not report for the reasons we talked about, but by reporting it, you may actually be preventing another woman from being assaulted. Ask a relative or a friend to take you to a hospital if you can't get an ambulance or a police car. Seek help in an assertive way. In this way, injuries that you're unaware of may be detected. Get written or photographic records to document the condition so that you can use it in a potential court case. Ask about biological risks, what treatments are available, and whatever help will make you comfortable when talking with health professionals. Things you can do to reduce the risk of sexual assault. And again, like I said, the number one thing that can be done is to educate men to reduce instances of it. Teach boys and men don't rape. But that being said, there's still things women can do. One, establish a set of signals with other women in the building or neighborhood to convey if you are in trouble. List yourself in the phone directory and mailbox by first initials only. This is one that is mainly for stranger sexual assault, and I'll come back to that in just a second, but it's definitely the case where some people choose their victims based on phone directories, mailboxes, things like that. Use deadbolt locks to secure your doors. Lock windows, install iron grids on first floor windows. Keep doorways and entries well lit. Keep your keys handy when approaching the car or the front door. All of these, again, go back to stranger sexual assault. They don't work necessarily with acquaintance or date rape, but they are things that can help with stranger sexual assault. Don't walk by yourself after dark. Avoid deserted areas. Do not allow strange men into your house. Keep your car doors locked, windows up, check the back seat before entering, don't live in a risky building, don't give rides to hitchhikers, don't converse with strange men on the street, shout fire, not rape, because more likely to get a response. Rape, aggression, defense, I've got that here. Before I get to that, again, these are all about stranger sexual assault, and it's good advice. Just be aware that this is the minority of cases of sexual assault that do occur. The majority are an acquaintance, and the biggest thing you can do there is to be in control of the situation. Reduce alcohol intake, things like that. The last one that's here is RAD classes, rape, aggression, defense. I used to recommend against RAD because rape, aggression, defense used to be about teaching how to fight back. Now rape, aggression, defense actually teaches it more properly, and that is that the best thing to do is to try and get away, not to actually fight back. Fighting back can lead to more violence against the individual, because as you start punching the perpetrator or kicking the perpetrator, it can make them angry, and then they are more likely to be aggressive and cause physical harm. Going back to that I talked about earlier about how many cases don't involve physical harm. Fighting back can increase the risk of physical harm. I'm not saying that you should just give in, but fighting back can increase the chance of risk or death. The best thing to do is to use these techniques to get away, and that's what rape, aggression, defense classes are now focusing on, is these techniques of getting away and getting out of the situation. And this is good advice, all of this. What's the problem with this in the previous slides list? I've already mentioned this. It's talking about stranger rape when the majority of cases are an acquaintance, someone you know. So what are some adjustments that survivors of sexual assault can do? First of all, many survivors are extremely distraught for days. If you know someone who has been a victim of sexual assault, giving them support is important. If you yourself are a victim, seeking out support is important. People who are victims often report eating disorders, headaches, irritability, mood changes, anxiety, depression, menstrual irregularity. After the event, all of this, it can cause severe disruption to a person's life. The person may become withdrawn, sullen, mistrustful. This is where that depression comes in, that anxiety comes in, and again, this very big effect on a person's life. Some individuals may experience guilt or shame, especially if they feel partially to blame for the assault. And again, this goes back to, as I said before, you shouldn't feel responsible. You are not responsible. You shouldn't feel guilty. It is the guy who did it. It is his fault. For many individuals, they experience rape trauma syndrome. That is for several weeks after the attack, behave in a disorganized, disoriented manner, cry uncontrollably, experience feelings of anger, shame, fear, nervousness. One strong recommendation is counseling, and as I said on the previous slide, to seek out support from others. Seeking support from the others can have, if for any time you're talking about a psychological disorder or psychological effect that you're suffering from, that seeking out help from others has positive effects. Long-term adjustment, though, involves coming to terms with the feelings and being able to remember the event without re-experiencing it. One of the things that was pushed for a while in psychology was to forget events, but another thing that's been pushed is this remembering it. This last one being said, have to know that you don't have to, what's been found with recent research is you don't have to be able to think about the event without re-experiencing it. You can possibly just put it behind you and stop thinking about it. Obviously, easier said than done, but it's not something that you have to keep thinking about over and over again. to get over. Main thing here is seek out counseling, therapy, that type of thing to help you. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about here for the next couple of slides is sexual abuse of children. We'll talk about this a little bit more a little bit later in the semester, but I want to cover it briefly here. So this sexual abuse of children may range from exhibitionism, kissing, fondling, sexual touching, oral, anal, vaginal intercourse. It runs the full gambit. Actually, in a majority of cases, it doesn't involve actual intercourse, but it can involve all of these. And again, any sexual contact between an adult and a child is abusive. The child is below the age of consent, their brain hasn't fully developed, they cannot consent to what is going on. So much like with adults, the majority of cases of molestation and sexual assault on children are perpetrated by someone that the child knows. 4 out of 5 are abused by a relative, family, friend, or acquaintance. The average age of abuse is between 6 and 12 for girls and 7 and 10 for boys. The most common thing to occur is genital fondling. And like I said on the previous slide, what can occur is penetration, but for the majority of cases, it is just fondling. We will talk about this a little bit more later in the semester. One thing that is disturbing is that abused children rarely report the abuse, and if they do report it, it's usually hushed up. That is typically because it's a family member or a close acquaintance of a family friend, and what ends up happening there is when it does occur, the parents don't report it to the authorities, they just hush it up and then attempt to keep the children away from that person in the future. And it's estimated that as much as 95% of cases are actually not reported to the authorities. I actually saw a study that reported that about 3 out of 5 or 60% of women are molested or raped in their lifetime. And in that same, so that's disturbing, that's a large number. In that same study, I saw that as many as 10, if not more percent of men commit an act of sexual assault on a child, commit an act of molestation in their lifetime. And that's even more disturbing, that 10% of men, you look around, 1 out of every 10 guys you see is in their lifetime likely to commit an act of molestation on a child. Those are scary numbers. Like I said, we'll come back to it later. One thing to talk about now, though, is the effects of child sexual abuse. In children who have been abused, they tend to have anger, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, tend to have inappropriate sexual behaviors themselves, sexual self-destructive behavior, sexual promiscuity as they get older, even abuse of children themselves when they get older, more likely to abuse drugs, more likely to attempt suicide, have higher rates of PTSD, lower self-esteem, possibly even more sexual dysfunction in various different ways, more mistrust of others, and more feelings of detachment. There are prevention programs out there, and it's important to teach children to understand what sexual abuse is, how they can avoid it, what is good touching, what is bad touching, and encourage children to report it, teach children messages like it's not your fault, and remind the child and families that they'll be safe, because those who perpetrate these abuses tend to threaten that if they tell anyone, that they will hurt the child or their family or their pets. So reminding the child that they and their families are safe if they report it is important. And it's very important for families to report this to the authorities because of how detrimental it is to the children, and how those who commit this tend to be serial perpetrators. They tend to continue to commit it on the same individuals or other individuals. Okay, this wraps up the first set of slides. There will be more sets of slides posted now that I have the recordings working properly. Thank you. So at the end here, I have a video from UDM Support Services. Let's watch that.
Hello, and thank you so much for your time in watching this short video presentation. My name is Rachel Rajeski. I'm one of the personal counselors working at the Wellness Center on the main campus. I have a short presentation for you that Hello, and thank you so much for your time in watching this short video presentation. My name is Rachel Rajeski. I'm one of the personal counselors working at the Wellness Center on the main campus. I have a short presentation for you that will give you the contact information in case you're seeking out personal counseling services or you need to set up a medical appointment. Bear with me for just a moment as I share my screen with you. So again, the Wellness Center is located on the main campus. We are in the West Quad. This semester and potentially into the next, because of COVID, it is important that you call ahead for any services. Services such as seeking out the medical clinic or personal counseling require a phone call first before you come to our building. This is important to note because we can only have one student in the clinic at a time due to COVID. So again, while the hours and times are listed here, please call ahead to be sure that a staff member can assist you. Our wellness clinic is directed by Dr. Anna Maria Silveri. She oversees both the personal counseling side as well as the medical side. For counseling staff, myself and Erica Budson are the two full-time counselors, and Natalie is a part-time counselor. We are currently in the process of hiring another full-time counselor. So if by chance you are placed on a wait list, it shouldn't be too much longer. We have hopes this person will be in place very soon. On the medical clinic side, we also are in the process of putting a nurse practitioner back into that position. So please bear with us during this time of transition as we work on hiring a new full-time nurse practitioner. Again, you can still contact the clinic if you have questions or concerns about future appointments, or if you have questions or concerns about your student health insurance, please reach out to our office manager, Martha Mack. On the personal counseling side, we see students for a variety of issues: trauma, grief, loss, adjustments to what's happening in the world right now, stress, test anxiety. This is a free service and everything is completely confidential. There's no need to pay us. We don't need insurance. And we have the same confidentiality as if you were seeking out a counselor in the community. If you need a safe, non-judgmental space to talk about whatever you're going through right now, please feel free to reach out to us. On the health clinic side, again, we offer a variety of services. You'll just have to bear with us shortly while we work through this transition period in hiring a new nurse practitioner. And please call ahead before you come to the health clinic. If you are seeking out personal counseling services, potentially for someone else, let's say a faculty member is concerned, or you have a friend you're worried about, some of the behaviors that might be concerning for you are listed here. It's important to know if you're noticing those behaviors in a student that is in your classroom, or a friend of yours, or even our resident aides that might notice things in the dorm members, that the student must make the contact. So if you're a faculty member or a friend of someone that you're concerned about, you can support them in sitting with them as they send an email directly to me. You could even sit with them, dial the phone for them, maybe get me on the phone, but ultimately the person who's seeking out counseling services must be the person that talks to me. So it's important to note, you can support the person through this process. However, you cannot be the person that reaches out. I cannot contact any student without breaking confidentiality. They have to reach out to me first and ask for the services. Here's our contact information. Again, for medical appointments, it's important that you call the number listed at the top, 1185. To be ensured that you are the only student in the clinic because of COVID, and also that a staff member is available to assist you. For personal counseling appointments, the best way to get in contact with me is email. Please send me an email if you are the student seeking out the services. Once you send me an email within 24 to 48 business hours, I will reach back out to you and send you an intake form. It's important that you complete both the front and back of this form and then return it to me by email. If for some reason you can't send it back via email, you are welcome to drop it off at the health clinic during their business hours. Again, you might need to call ahead. Once you've completed this form and returned it to us, within 24 to 48 business hours, I will reach back out to you and let you know if we have matched you with a counselor or if you might be on that brief waiting list. Again, we're going through some transitions here, so please bear with us as we get new full-time staff in place. If for some reason I am not available due to being out on vacation or out sick, please contact my supervisor, Dr. Anna Maria Silveri. If you have any further questions or concerns about...
Okay, I don't know if I came through while she was talking, but this video was recorded during the pandemic about a year ago. So a lot of the things she said don't apply anymore, as in you have to schedule appointments and there's only one in allowed at a time. I think they've already hired a new nurse practitioner, all of that. But the overarching message of the video is still relevant. If you need to seek out support, the support is there for you. That's all I have for this lecture. Thanks. Come on back.